John Henry Menzies was a highly innovative designer and carver in the late colonial period. The Stanford Pātaka Cabinet dates from 1897 and is one of the highlights of his career. With its impressive size, sculptural qualities, and its combined Māori and Pākehā stylistic features. From his arrival in New Zealand aged 21 in 1860, Menzies was a farmer. First in Murihiku, Southland, and then on to Pataka o Waiwhetū, Banks Peninsula. After moving to Kirikiriwaria, Menzies Bay, Te Pataka o Waiwhetū, Banks Peninsula, with his young family in 1877, he began living another life parallel to farming. One where he carved, designed, and produced a large body of work. From the 1880s to 1910, over 90 pieces of Menzies carved furniture have been catalogued. He also designed and decorated 3 houses and St. Luke's Church at Little Akaroa, and is known for his 1910 book, Māori Patterns Painted and Carved. Farming had worked out well for Menzies. Financially, he seems to have been pretty well off, and this is reflected in the furniture he produced. For example, as well as its impressive size, none of the timber on the Stanford Pātaka Cabinet was grown locally. The carved wood on this cabinet is walnut from America, popular for high-grade furniture at the time. Its structural timber is kauri, from Te Ika o Maui, the North Island. Again, good cuts, with no expense spared. One thing we can take from his financial status is that Menzies could have commissioned his carving work to be done by a tohunga whakairo, a master Māori carver. Other Pākehā did this to decorate their homes. But Menzies was committed to doing the work himself, from the design through to the cabinet making and carving, although he had no formal background or training in any of these. Perhaps the only way he could communicate his vision was to make it. Menzies' pursuit of Māori art took great commitment. Starting out carving when and where he did, there was no path laid out to follow. There were no books on toi Māori in any comprehensive way in the 1880s, and because Te Pataka o Waiwhetū, Banks Peninsula, was distant from any centres of Māori carving, there was no opportunity to learn from a tohunga whakairo, a master carver, as some Pākehā did. One particular event from his early creative period stands out. An 1887 North Island holiday that took him to Te Aroha, Ohinamutu and Rotorua. At these places, he would have seen examples of huahuana, Māori architecture, intrinsically adorned with whakairo, carving, tukutuku, woven wall panels, ko whaiwhai, painting on rafters and other unadorned features, and possibly carvers at work. This may have been the watershed moment, provoking both his fascination with Māori art and an inspiration to create. He later wrote about the beauty of toi Māori and its uniqueness to Aotearoa. The majority of Menzies' study of taonga and toi Māori took place away from Māori communities in museums and private collections, and from photographs. His access to toi Māori was through a Pākehā filter. This meant he never really gained access to an Indigenous understanding and knowledge of toi Māori. He didn't comprehend how and what it communicated, and his carving lacked meaning and syntax to an Indigenous observer. It looked like toi Māori, but was rendered without whakapapa and cultural context. He wrote about collecting the patterns. For him, this meant abstracting patterns from the taonga he studied and recording the designs as a way of learning to carve them accurately. These patterns were then translated to his furniture. The Stanford family Pātaka Cabinet is at once a product of its time, but also, in many ways, quite atypical. There were other 19th century Pākehā who tried their hand at carving Māori patterns and figures, particularly onto chairs, but none were as prolific as Menzies, and none took the step of designing furniture to accommodate Māori architectural forms like the Pataka model on this cabinet. Māori carvers were also producing a wider range of objects in response to the colonial context and a changed economy. There are examples of carved furniture like chairs, carved mantelpieces, and also objects like model, whare whakairo and wakatoa. Māori carvers produced these things on commission from Pākehā patrons as gifts or for the souvenir market sold to Pākehā, but there were also Māori consumers and recipients. Arguably, there was a space at this time in which these non-customary works were produced and existed, a bracketed space between the grammar of Toi Māori and design and the grammar of European art and design, a place where these two cultures intersected. We could look at Menzies' work as entering this area between cultures. During J.H. Menzies' creative period, Pākehā society was experiencing a shift in identity. There was a strong emotional connection to Britain, but at the same time, the first generation of Aotearoa New Zealand-born Pākehā were coming to maturity. Their emotional connection was here, and they were trying to find ways of expressing that. Increasingly, their personal connections were here. Nevertheless, they didn't see themselves as Pacific people. When it came to architecture and design, the same was true. There was a desire to create a New Zealand style, but Pākehā were looking back to Europe to find that. In Ōtautahi, Christchurch, the legacy of this is visible in the Gothic revival architecture of the earlier public buildings, such as the Canterbury Museum and those around the Arts Centre. The furniture historian William Cottrell has pointed out that the basic shape of the Stanford family Pātaka Cabinet, its silhouette, actually conforms to other examples of Gothic revival furniture. Squint your eyes and concentrate on the cabinet's outline only. You can see its relationship to the work of British designers like William Burgess, Charles Eastlake, and Bruce Talbot, who utilised Gothic architectural themes in their work. In this respect, the cabinet was a very contemporary piece of furniture connecting to British design. The hand-worked decoration and reference to the vernacular, here Toi Māori and Huahuana Māori architecture, was certainly also valued in the design reform movement in Britain. Menzies' cabinet cleverly intersected with the British and local Gothic revival movement. But unsquint your eyes. Take in the whole cabinet. And what you see is something that is entirely and unmistakably inscribed with an Aotearoa New Zealand identity. It is interesting to consider how the cabinet would have been experienced in its intended context, which was a family home, not a gallery. Seen in the ever-changing natural light from a window, or by flickering firelight in the evening, the Pāwashal eyes would gleam. The carved elements would appear to be almost moving, alive. Even in the steady light of the gallery, you can see illusions of depth created on its flat surfaces. This is evocative of the heritage of the carving and reminiscent of descriptions of the interior of 19th century wharerunanga. Pākehā encountering this furniture, or indeed living with it, were in contact with toi whakairo as an art form, but the work was produced through a translated, disconnected process where the involvement of a Māori artist was entirely absent. This might be viewed as a localising activity, something that linked Pākehā to being of and from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Or it might be viewed as an expression by Menzies that Māori culture was a fundamental component of the broader national culture. In this respect, he was quite at odds with the architectural establishment. Samuel Hurst Seeger, the leading Christchurch architect of Menzies' day, stated in 1900 that Māori art was scarcely suitable as a standard on which to found our national taste. 40 years later, the head of Auckland University's Architecture School evaluated that Māori architecture could have little effect on contemporary design. In this light, the Stanford Pātaka Cabinet can be viewed as a challenging piece of design and decoration. Today, there is no getting away from the culturally appropriative nature of Menzies' work. This sort of appropriation is bound up with the colonial context of the period and the resultant power imbalance. In his context, Menzies would never have thought to question his use of Māori designs. Indeed, quite the opposite. Menzies believed he was helping perpetuate toi Māori. In colonial New Zealand, an array of Pākehā men positioned themselves as experts in Māori culture and history, writing and presenting papers to each other in urban environments, quite detached from Māori communities. This equated to an intellectual colonisation, or perhaps as an intellectual phase of colonisation. Roger Blakely described it as a milieu of amateur gentlemanly scholarship. Its focus was on the Māori past, particularly pre-contact Māori culture. J.H. Menzies went in a totally different direction. Unlike his peers, Menzies was busy incorporating Māori patterns, figures and designs into contemporary furniture and buildings, everyday Pākehā things and places. This is what makes Menzies' creative output different, interesting and significant. The Stanford Pātaka Cabinet reveals Menzies' deep respect for toi Māori. It is literally carved into it. Far from regarding toi Māori as some sort of second-tier savage art, as his contemporary Hurst Seeger called it, Menzies wrote, "I have attempted to collect and perpetuate these beautiful patterns. I have carved most of them in wood and stone myself, and have been more and more struck by the good tact and art shown in them. If I have made some mistakes, it is not done willfully. I have simply copied from photos and also from Māori carving all the patterns I could lay my hands on. I do not pretend that this is a complete collection. There are probably many more patterns, and it now remains for some Māori of good birth to improve upon what I have done. Also, I do not think that Māori art is composed only of carving and painting. Most beautiful work was done by the rangatira women, and such work often took years to finish, and was of even greater value than the carving done by the men. And I do hope that some Māori woman of good birth and wealth will publish a book of Māori matte patterns."